The 1970s were a bold era for British dinners. From quirky party foods to comforting casseroles, the decade served up dishes that were as memorable as they were unusual. Some became instant classics, while others are now just nostalgia on a plate. Let's take a look at 15 British dinners from the 1970s that have faded into history and find out why they disappeared from our tables. Kicking things off with something sweet and slightly surreal, let's talk about Ambrosia Salad. This wasn't a salad in the traditional sense, but rather a creamy, fruit-laden concoction that often appeared at British dinner parties and buffet spreads in the 1970s. Imported from America's fascination with dessert salads, it mixed tinned fruit cocktail, marshmallows, desiccated coconut, and whipped cream or custard into one pastel-coloured bowl of indulgence. For many households, it felt modern, playful, and a little bit exotic compared to the plainer puddings of the past. Part of its charm was convenience. Everything came from a tin or packet, so it could be made in minutes. But as tastes shifted toward fresher, lighter options, Ambrosia Salad started to look overly sweet and artificial. By the 1980s, it was considered outdated, a sugary relic of an experimental decade. Today, it survives only in themed retro nights or as a nostalgic nod to a long-gone food fad. Nothing captured the spirit of a 1970s British dinner party quite like fondue. It wasn't just a meal, it was an event. With a pot of molten cheese bubbling away in the centre of the table, guests armed with long forks dipped hunks of bread, vegetables, or even meat into the gooey mixture. For hosts, it was the perfect showpiece, easy to prepare, yet guaranteed to impress. Fondue brought a slice of continental flair into British homes at a time when foreign food felt adventurous and glamorous. The Swiss Cheese Union's global promotion of the dish also helped make it a middle-class status symbol, signalling that the host was fashionable and in touch with modern dining trends. But its very indulgence was its undoing. By the 1980s, heavy cheese and wine-based meals felt outdated against lighter, quicker food. Today, fondue lingers mostly as a nostalgic throwback, wheeled out for retro parties or cozy winter gatherings. Among the colourful array of 1970s British dinners, few dishes carried as much royal flair as Coronation Chicken. Originally created in 1953 for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, this cold chicken dish mixed curry powder with mayonnaise, cream, and dried fruits like sultanas or apricots. By the 1970s, it had firmly settled into the mainstream, often appearing at buffets, picnics, and as a go-to dinner party centerpiece. What made Coronation Chicken so beloved was its balance of exotic and familiar. Curry powder gave a mild, foreign twist without overwhelming the palate, while the creamy sauce and tender chicken kept it comfortably British. It also fits the decade's love of convenience, easy to prepare ahead of time, and elegant enough to serve guests. Yet, as tastes modernized, its heavy, mayo-laden dressing and dated presentation made it fade from fashionable dining tables. Still, it remains a nostalgic icon, occasionally revived for royal celebrations or retro-themed meals. When people look back at the strangest dinners Britain embraced in the 1970s, ham and banana hollandaise almost always tops the list. This bizarre creation involved wrapping bananas in slices of ham, smothering them in hollandaise sauce, and baking the whole thing until bubbling. It might sound like a culinary prank today, but in its time it was clipped straight from glossy cookbooks and proudly served at dinner tables. The reasoning made sense in the context of the decade. Bananas still carried an exotic edge, ham was affordable and versatile, and hollandaise added a creamy, continental flourish. Put together, it promised a dish that was easy, adventurous, and sure to get guests talking. The problem, of course, was the taste. Sweet fruit colliding with salty ham and heavy sauce proved too strange to last. Now, ham and banana hollandaise survives mostly in retro food lists, remembered more for shock value than flavour. If there was one dish that made 1970s dinners feel just a little more glamorous, it was chicken Kiev, cutting into that crispy breadcrumb shell to reveal a gush of garlic butter felt like theatre on a plate, and it gave home cooks a dish that was simple yet showy. For a Britain just warming up to international flavours, this Eastern European import quickly became a household name. Part of its rise was thanks to the frozen food boom. Supermarkets stocked ready-made Kievs that looked elegant but required minimal effort, fitting perfectly into the busy, convenience-driven lifestyle of the decade. The buttery richness and satisfying crunch made it a favourite for dinner parties and family meals alike. Still, its heavy flavour profile and old-school presentation saw it fade as global cuisines and lighter dishes became more popular in the 80s and 90s. Even so, chicken Kiev remains a nostalgic symbol of 1970s dining chic. Few meals of the 1970s carried the same air of continental class as beef stroganoff. It was the kind of dish people proudly served when they wanted to impress guests without straying too far from familiar flavours. Rich strips of beef, silky cream, sautéed mushrooms, and a dash of brandy made it both comforting and elegant, a step above the usual meat and potatoes dinners. For British home cooks, stroganoff represented the growing fascination with international cuisine. Cookbooks of the era showcased it as a glamorous import from Russia, while magazines praised its versatility, served over rice or noodles. It wasn't complicated, but it felt worldly, which was exactly the mood of the 70s dinner table. The downside? Its heavy cream base and rich sauce made it less appealing once lighter, healthier meals became fashionable. Today, beef stroganoff lingers as a nostalgic favourite, retro, indulgent, and a reminder of when dinner party food meant pulling out all the stops. Long before it was mocked as quiche cliché, this dish was the star of many 1970s British dinner parties. Quiche Lorraine, with its buttery pastry shell filled with eggs, cream, cheese and bacon, arrived from France carrying an air of sophistication. For families eager to add something continental to the table, it felt like a leap into modern dining. The appeal was obvious. It was elegant without being difficult, flexible enough to serve warm or cold, and impressive enough to win approving nods from guests. Cookbooks and women's magazines of the decade pushed quiche as the perfect centerpiece, reflecting Britain's growing taste for European cuisine. But what soared quickly also fell just as fast. By the 1980s, overexposure left quiche looking tired and lighter. Fresher meals made its rich filling less fashionable. Even so, quiche Lorraine remains etched in food nostalgia, remembered as the dish that once defined stylish dining in Britain. At a time when vegetarianism was only just starting to make its way into mainstream Britain, the 1970s dinner table offered up the nut roast as its meat-free alternative. Packed with ground nuts, breadcrumbs, onions, herbs, and sometimes vegetables, it was designed to mimic the hearty feel of a roast without the beef or lamb. For many vegetarians, it quickly became a staple, not glamorous but comforting and filling. The nut roast reflected a cultural shift, interest in alternative lifestyles, whole foods, and the growing health food movement made people more curious about meatless dishes. Cookbooks of the time promoted it as both wholesome and thrifty, fitting neatly into a decade that valued experimentation. But despite its earnestness, the nut roast often struggled with a reputation for being dry, heavy, and uninspiring compared to traditional roasts. While it still has a niche following today, in the 1970s it stood as a marker of changing diets and emerging vegetarian identity. For all the exotic imports that defined 1970s British dining, some meals held fast to tradition, and few were as iconic as steak and kidney pudding. This hearty classic, with its sweet crust wrapped around tender beef kidney and rich gravy, represented comfort food at its most unapologetic. At a time when dinner parties often leaned toward continental flair, the pudding remained a reminder of Britain's own culinary backbone. Its strength lay in its ability to feed a family with affordable cuts of meat while still feeling substantial. Steaming the sweat pastry until it turned soft and savoury gave the dish its distinctive texture, making it perfect for cold evenings. But as the decade wore on, its long cooking time and heavy richness began to feel out of place compared to quicker, lighter meals. While no longer a regular on modern tables, steak and kidney pudding remains a nostalgic staple of classic British cuisine. Not every 1970s dinner was about sticking to British roots. Some were borrowed straight from abroad. Swedish meatballs, with their bite-sized shape, creamy gravy, and simple seasoning, found their way from Scandinavian cookbooks into British homes during the decade. They were exotic enough to feel new, yet familiar enough to win over even the most cautious eaters. Their rise was helped by the growing popularity of Scandinavian design and culture, which extended beyond furniture into food. Cookbooks and magazines promoted them as a stylish alternative to the usual mince-based meals, and they worked just as well at family dinners as they did at dinner parties. Served with mashed potatoes, lingonberry jam, or even rice, Swedish meatballs offered versatility at a time when people were experimenting more in the kitchen. By the 1980s, though, their novelty had worn off, and they became more associated with convenience than glamour. Still, they remain a nostalgic taste of 70s experimentation. Sometimes the most old-fashioned dishes managed to cling to the 1970s table, even as new trends swept in. Potted shrimps, a classic from the northwest coast of England, were one such survivor. Small brown shrimp were simmered gently in spiced butter, then packed into little pots where the butter solidified into a rich seal. Served cold with toast or crusty bread, it was simple, salty, and unmistakably British. The appeal in the 70s lay in its tradition. At a time when households were flirting with continental imports like quiche and fondue, potted shrimps reminded people of local flavours and seaside heritage. They fit easily into buffets and dinner spreads, offering a touch of elegance without being foreign or complicated. Yet the very qualities that made them classic, heavy butter, strong flavour, and a laborious prep eventually worked against them as tastes shifted toward lighter, fresher seafood. Today, potted shrimps are more a delicacy than a dinner table regular. Few dishes confuse modern ears quite like mock goose. Despite its grand-sounding name, it had nothing to do with poultry at all. Instead, this clever meatless bake used layers of potatoes, apples, onions, and herbs to create a filling main course that looked and felt more indulgent than it really was. For families trying to stretch their budgets, in the 1970s, it was a familiar solution, carried over from earlier decades. The dish was less about fooling anyone into thinking they were eating goose and more about comfort. The mix of savoury onions and sweet apples gave it character, while the potatoes made it hearty enough to stand alone on the dinner table. It was the kind of meal that could be assembled cheaply and baked slowly, feeding a family without fuss. But as meat became more accessible and tastes grew more adventurous, mock goose slipped quietly into the background, remembered today mostly as a relic of frugal British cooking. Creamy, rich, and just a little bit fancy, Salmon Mornay was a dish that brought a touch of sophistication to 1970s British dining. Built on the classic French Mornay sauce, a bechamel enhanced with cheese, it transformed tinned or fresh salmon into a bubbling, golden-topped casserole. For households eager to present something stylish without veering too far from comfort food, it was the perfect middle ground. Part of its charm lay in accessibility. While the word Mornay sounded posh, the dish itself relied on affordable staples: canned salmon, butter, milk, and cheese. Add breadcrumbs on top, and you had a main course that looked impressive coming out of the oven. It was hearty enough for family meals, but elegant enough for guests, making it a versatile choice in an era when entertaining at home was on the rise. Over time, though, its heavy creaminess lost appeal as lighter seafood recipes gained popularity, leaving Salmon Mornay behind as a retro favourite. For many kids growing up in 1970s, Britain dessert wasn't complete without a brightly coloured packet of Angel Delight. Just a quick whisk with milk turned the powder into a fluffy, mousse-like pudding that felt almost magical. Parents loved it because it was cheap and foolproof, while children were hooked on the novelty of flavours like strawberry, chocolate, and the ever-nostalgic butterscotch. It wasn't just a sweet, it was a cultural moment. TV adverts in the 70s made Angel Delight seem like the ultimate treat, promising happiness in a bowl. Compared to the effort of traditional puddings, this instant dessert was effortless, making it a weeknight staple across the UK. While its popularity has waned with changing tastes and a push for fresher options, it still sparks warm nostalgia. For those who grew up with it, the very mention of Angel Delight can bring back memories of after-school treats and colourful kitchen tables. Among the many weeknight saviours of 1970s Britain, few dishes carried the same reputation for thrift and convenience as Tuna Casserole. Built around inexpensive canned tuna, this hearty bake combines pasta or egg noodles with cream of mushroom soup, peas and a crunchy topping of breadcrumbs or crisps. For busy families, it was the definition of cheap, filling and comforting. Part of its appeal was how adaptable it was. Some households stretched it further with extra vegetables, while others leaned into indulgence by adding more cheese. The casserole format itself was central to 1970s cooking trends, easy to assemble, simple to bake, and capable of feeding a crowd without breaking the bank. Though modern diners might find it heavy or dated, Tuna Casserole once stood proudly as a go-to dinner that balanced budget with flavour. Today, it survives mostly as a nostalgic reminder of the no-nonsense, practical approach to family cooking in Britain's past. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if you remembered some of these dinners, and don't forget to subscribe for more information and nostalgia. See you next time.